Let's have some fun. Timeless. Love, Morgenthau and Me. Lucinda Franks. Why write this book?
Well, Dan, I think my husband is known as a brilliant prosecutor, but he is not really known as who he really is. And I wanted to write a book about relationships, about a marriage, an intimate view of a marriage. And I thought, well, I could write about our marriage, and I could also tell people what Bob was really like. He wasn't just the reserved, stiff, Old Testament furious prosecutor. He was really a quirky, funny, gentle, loving human being.
And why write it now?
Because I felt like it.
Well, that's reason enough.
I think journalists and writers of fiction and nonfiction really have to feel their subject. They have to kind of get that fizz of, gee, what he said was funny, or, wow, that was deep. And they begin to, take root in your imagination. So that's what happened.
And what do you hope that people will take away from this book? If you pick one single thing that you hope after they read the book they take away, what would that be?
I think it would be that no matter how difficult relationships are, how many foibles and ups and downs you have, that you stick by your partner, your friend, and you don't walk away. You don't ever walk away.
Mr. Morgenthau, when Lucinda came to you and said she was going to write this book, did you have reservations, and if so, what were they?
Well, I thought when you marry a writer, you got to expect him to write a book. So it didn't take me by surprise. And I thought she was a first-rate reporter, and I was a talented writer, and I was sure she'd do a good job.
And what's your absolute favorite part of the book?
There's no one. Before we were married, we went to a buffet dinner where a member of a leading Boston family, woman, married to a prominent New York lawyer who had been the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And the wife was holding forth about, she didn't know why the United States should have to finance or support Israel. There are a lot of rich Jews who could do it. And Lucinda heard that and took her on. And she said, we all have responsibility for what happened to the Jews under Nazi Germany, and we all have a responsibility to help them with a homeland. And various people came to sort of try to see if they couldn't arbitrate the discussion, including the director of the FBI, but they saw this was a blood feud, and she wouldn't let go, and she kept saying, we all have that responsibility, Christians and Jews alike. So I was very proud of her, and I knew that we were really on the same team.
Now, this was before you got married.
Yes, that was a year or two before, yeah.
Well, is it fair or unfair to say that after that moment, you knew you were going to marry her?
Well, I knew I'd made the right choice if she would marry me.
On the other hand, I felt that I had totally blown any chance of having a relationship with Robert Morgenthau, since I thought he would be so humiliated. But we got our coats and I looked up, and he was grinning this huge grin, and he said, "That was your finest moment."
I want to take you back to the moment when Lucinda took you to some fairly down and out place in the village to hear a reading of Ginsberg's poem, Howl. I want to take you back to the moment. You remember that? It was a reading of Ginsberg's poem. Ginsberg was not there. He was
Right.
not gone.
I remember, yeah.
What were you thinking then? I mean, here you are, one of the most distinguished families from one of the most distinguished families, not just in New York, but in the United States of America. Part of the, by anybody's reckoning, part of the establishment of New York. And here you are with this young woman down in the village listening to a reading of Howl. I want to know what was going through your mind at that time.
I can't tell you what was going through my mind, but the thing that I always remember is that my grandfather came here as a 10-year-old immigrant, not speaking a word of English. Was able to get into City College 6 years later, had to drop out because his father said you have to help support the family, work in the law office. Got into Columbia Law School without having graduated from college. Had to wait a year to get admitted to the bar and was a member of this temple. So, you know, you talk about distinguished. Everybody started at the bottom and worked their way up. So I never thought of myself as coming from a prominent or distinguished background. I was aware of where my grandparents came from and the adversity they had, the efforts they had to establish a new life here in New York.
The age difference. How early on did you discuss the age difference, or did you discuss the age difference at all?
We never felt different in age. I mean, he, you know, at first, when he became my source, when I was on the New York Times, I thought, well, he's my source. I mean, you know, he's never going to be anything else. I was 26, he was 56, he was an old man. But once we became, you know, romantically involved, it was like the years closed. I mean, there was no sense of a difference in our age. We hiked, we skated, we traveled, we did all the things two people of the same age did, and it was very odd, but there was no difference.
Well, you write in the book that your families were not exactly receptive to the engagement. Tell us about that.
Well, if you can imagine the Pope asking Squeaky Frome for her hand in marriage, that was how our families reacted. Bob's extended family, particularly, one of his cousins asked him to see a psychiatrist. Few others stopped speaking to him. My father was the only one that was alive, my father and sister, and they were fine with it. But all my radical friends, all my hippie cohorts dropped me. I had married into the establishment. Bob was dedicated to upholding the law. We were dedicated to breaking it. And I had broken my compact with them.
And Bob, on your side of the family, surely someone said to you, do you know what you're doing? Are you sure you know what you're doing? Tell us about what the reaction was of your family when you said, I want to marry this woman.
I said, I was sure I made the right decision. I mean, I think age is a state of mind. It's not a chronological pattern. And I didn't feel there was any major age difference between Lucinda and me, and fortunately, I proved that to be right. And I mean, we enjoy the same things. We like to go to less traveled countries, like we were in Croatia a year ago and had a great time, and to Portugal. And I say age is a state of mind. And if you're young in heart, young in mind, the number of years are not important.
But when you were making it known that the two of you were engaged, outside of your family, was there anybody in your professional circle who said, Bob, has she hypnotized you? Are you smoking something expensive or something like that?
No, I had good friends, and nobody ever said that to me.
Lucinda, what would you say? There's some of this in the book, but talk to us about what you consider to be the single biggest misconception about you and Bob's union.
About mine?
About the two of you being together.
There are many misconceptions. People accused me of wanting to, his cousins really, accused me of wanting to marry Bob for his stature and his well-to-do, sort of well-to-do state in life. And I mean, this was so bizarre to me because I hated money. I mean, I was totally against, the rich and the powerful and that state of being. So I didn't want to marry money, and I didn't care about stature. In fact, Bob's stature was a drawback to me because I lost all my friends. And I think that, it just, we were totally misinterpreted.
So you lost all of your friends. What did your friends say to you, or did they just walk away silently?
Oh, no, they didn't walk away silently. They said, "Are you crazy?" And, I mean, Bob was known as a liberal. He certainly wasn't a conservative. But, I mean, to cultural radicals, revolutionaries against the Vietnam War, this was, very, what Bob was unacceptable. And they thought I'd lost my mind. But the thing that I tried to tell them was that when love bites you, for want of another phrase, you can't turn your back. You try. I tried, but I guess kept coming back. And we kept coming back to each other, even though we both knew it wasn't the most ideal match in terms of age and, stature and whatever.
Mr. Morgenthau, I didn't give you a chance to say what you think is the biggest misconception about the union of the two of you.
Don't know if I know. I mean, my friends were all very supportive. Nobody said to me, you're crazy, you know what you're doing. So, I mean, there was some family hesitation, but my son, the time we got married, I had 4 daughters and 1 son. And my son was my best man at the wedding, and I found that generally people accepted what we were doing.
There's a lot of detail in the book, and I have 2 questions about that. One is, how did you put the book together? Did you keep a daily journal? Did you keep a weekly journal? Tell us how that much detail. You have a long reputation and won a Pulitzer Prize, among other things, for being a very accurate reporter. So tell us about the process of writing.
Well, I had a teacher named Edward Hoagland, who is a very eminent nature writer. And he said, always keep a notebook in your pocket. And I really have done that. I have kept a journal since I was in college. I kept a journal throughout our marriage. And when it came time for me to write this book, and by the way, Dan, I didn't tell Bob I was writing the book. You don't tell Bob you're doing anything as far as, you know, what he's concerned. I asked him if I could write the book. And we were in a romantic restaurant, and he kind of thought for a minute, and he said, well, sweetheart, do you think anybody would read it? And I said, I think so. You know, a memoir about us, about you. And he said, well, all right, write it. And I then began to feel guilty because he collapsed so easily. What I didn't know is that, of course I did know, that Bob does things, you know, not spontaneously as much as by design. He thinks very carefully about what decisions he makes. And he had decided a long time ago that of all the people that wanted to do his memoir, that wanted to do his biography, the publishers that had asked him, there would be only one person he would trust, and that would be me. So he was just waiting for me to ask. Now, what made me feel guilty was that would I be taking advantage of him? Would I be coloring the truth? And therefore, I said, let's go through my journals and see what we remember, what we don't remember. And what is really interesting is that if any of you have kept journals, burn them. Because there are things that happened in those journals that didn't happen in our memory. I mean, there was so many things that we did not remember. And they went in the book because I always like to have a second source, so I would often ask somebody, did that happen? And they would confirm it for me. Sometimes Bob would say, that did not happen, when I would write something for the drafts of the book. And then I said, well, wait a minute, let's go back to the journals. And we found that indeed he had said this or this had happened. So it became a Bible for us, the journals.
And I want to be respectful here because I know, as is common with people who saw as much combat as you saw, they don't like to talk about the war. But I want to take you back to the time when your ship was shot out from underneath you. That happened twice, once in each theater of war, by the way. But the first time that happened, and the ship is gone, you're in the water, did you think you would survive, or did you say to yourself, I think this is probably where I cash in?
Well, I thought I would survive. I made a deal with the Almighty when I didn't have a lot of bargaining power, saying that if I did survive, I'd try to do something useful with my life. But I thought I'd survive. I've always been an optimist.
But there's a lot of talk, particularly when the country has been at war as long as we have now, 12, 14 years, about post-traumatic stress disorder. Looking back on it, when you came home, after having not one but two vessels shot out from underneath you and seeing a lot of combat, looking back on it, do you think you suffered some version of that?
Well, I think I blacked out. I mean, I'll give you one example. They had a point system, and based on how old you were, how many years of service, combat, and so on. So I got my points when I was on a destroyer at Okinawa, and I came back on another destroyer. We went to Pearl Harbor and then to Seattle. But for 50 years, I could not remember the name of the destroyer I came back on. I completely blacked that out. It was only when my sister, who had kept my letters home, sent me a copy of a letter which I'd written on the stationery of the USS Law, L-A-W-E, and I realized that's the ship I came back on. But I had completely blacked out on that whole period.
Lucinda, when you first met Mr. Morgenthau, were you aware of his war record? Because the irony of you, anti-war activists, moving in a circle of anti-war activists, winding up with someone, hero's an overworked word, but a genuine hero of World War II. Were you aware of that record when you first met him?
No, I wasn't, and I don't think my generation was appreciative at all of what our parents' generation had gone through. What Bob didn't tell you, when the Lansdale sank, his ship that he was executive officer on, all of his men were floating around trying to stay afloat. He gave his life jacket up. He tried to save as many as he could, but he couldn't. And he watched them go down one by one. And the trauma of that is, to me, mind-boggling.
It would be to anyone, and by the way, the Lansdale was the first vessel
Yes.
that was shot out from underneath. Well, I want to come back to then as you got to know him and you got to know his war record, did you say to yourself, I'm not sure I can reconcile my personal feelings toward him with the differences between the two of us? Now it's not just a matter of age. It's you're an anti-war activist. Here's a person who, in World War II, distinguished himself. You see where I'm going with that? Did you feel conflicted at all?
Not ever. When we married, shortly after we married, the Vietnam War ended for good. Cambodia, everything. And I think that I began to appreciate what he had done during World War II when I found out that my father was a spy during World War II, towards the end of his life. And as I was reading about World War II, Bob was reading about World War II also. And we began to talk about what he had gone through. He began to tell me some things that he had never told anybody before. He really began to talk, as so many older veterans do. And he encouraged me to do the research on my father and to come to the conclusion that my father had done these different missions and that he was a hero as much as Bob was. So there was a coming together in an odd way over war between us.
Bob had mentioned earlier about coming together about Israel, the importance of Israel and responsibilities toward Israel. Bob, when you first met her, did you find that she was knowledgeable about the history of Israel? When you first met her, did you find she was knowledgeable about the history of Israel, or, as with many people, didn't know all that much about it?
No, she knew quite a bit about Israel. She'd learned that from her father. So no, she was quite knowledgeable, but I didn't realize she was as passionate about it, the support of Israel, until that evening.
Lucinda, I'm interested, and I think people would be interested in hearing you talk about, because you do write about it considerably in the book. Bob Morgenthau had a tremendous responsibility. When he came home, could he talk about the cases? Did he talk about the cases? Or was it a case of his, in effect, saying to you, I can't talk about what's happening at work?
Well, it depended on whether I wanted to write about it or not. We had a very firm line between what he did as a district attorney and what I did as a reporter. So he didn't mess with my stories. I didn't write about his. but we did talk about his cases confidentially because he wanted my feedback, and I was more likely to tell him to indict people like Bernard Goetz and crooks in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And I think he looked to me for some bolstering in that area. And we talked a lot about the cases.
Mr. Morgenthau, that the audience may not be aware that I think you were at least 89 or 90 years old when you prosecuted one of the most important cases prosecuted by any regional and local district attorney in the history of the country. And that was the case of these banks who were illegally fronting for Iran, laundering money out of Iran. Tell us about that case. I think a lot of people don't remember that case, and particularly why that case was not prosecuted by the federal government. After all, you were the district attorney in New York City.
Well, the first case was Lloyd's Bank, which incidentally was the bank of the royal family and the second biggest bank in Great Britain. And what they were doing, and they were doing it knowingly, they were processing payments from Iran to suppliers of material for weapons of mass destruction. And we obtained legally through search warrants and other legal matters some 12,000 emails. They were not aware that their emails could be recovered. And it was absolutely clear that this material that they were buying was to be used for missiles and for developing an atom bomb. So some of it was coming from a Chinese dealer, and we wanted to show that these were used for mass destruction purposes. So we took a sampling of the emails out to Raytheon Company in Phoenix, Arizona. Raytheon was the biggest manufacturer of anti-missile defenses. And his vice president came out, he was shocked. He said, I had no idea that the Iranians were this advanced or were this sophisticated. So I frankly could never understand why the administration, both Republican and Democrat, were not more interested in enforcing the sanctions. Because when we did Lloyd's, and then we did Credit Suisse, and then we did Barclays, and the Feds were not in it to the last minute, and then they came and adopted what we had done. But I think it was a big mistake, because I think personally it would be a huge mistake for either Israel or the United States to bomb Iran. But I think we can choke off their access to war material for weapons of mass destruction. And also we can hurt them seriously economically. So I think that it's important to have tough enforcement of the sanctions. And they're only beginning now to really tighten up, but there's still a lot of loose ends there. And the Treasury Department was not interested in enforcing the sanctions. There were a lot of people in the government who didn't want to see tough enforcement.
Well, I don't want to dwell on this, but I think it's important, first of all, to make sure that everybody understands what was happening. There were sanctions against Iran. The Iranians got around the sanctions by striking a deal with the banks, Lloyd's and the others you mentioned. And the deal was that the Iranians would make big deposits in the bank. The bank then, using its branches in the United States, would launder the money. And then Iranian operatives could get the money out in dollars, because the people who deal in these weapons, they're not interested in yen, they're not interested in euros, they want greenbacks, right? So then that allowed the Iranians to go to people like the Chinese weapons dealer and get the kind of material. That's basically what the case was. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right, that was one of the big cases, yes.
All right, now, I'm back to the question. You said that nobody in the federal government, particularly the Treasury Department, whether it was a Democratic or Republican administration, seemed that interested in this case. Again, why was that?
Well, I think part of the reason was that when outfits like Lehman Brothers would get into difficulty, they would look to a foreign bank to bail them out. And I think that was part of the reason. But I remember on Credit Suisse, it was just before my term was up, and we sat around, there were 21 lawyers around the table in the Justice Department, and the discussion was going nowhere. And I said to the House Counsel for Credit Suisse, how many dollars does the Iranian government have on deposit with your bank? And he said, oh, I wouldn't know. And I said, come on. I mean, in case people don't understand, deposits are the lifeblood of banks. They want deposits for which they pay very little, and then they lend out the money at a higher rate. So that's the heart of the banking business. And the way Iran got the cooperation of these banks was by making significant deposits in those banks. I think subsequently the federal government has become more interested, but I still think it's critical to have tough sanctions against Iran, not only to stop the development of weapons, but also to make it tough for the leadership because of a faltering economy.
When this particular case, keep in mind, Bob was what, 90, I think, when he prosecuted that case. Did you, even though by this time you've been married to him a long time, did you say to yourself, wow, my husband is 90 years old and counting, and he still has it in him to prosecute a case of this magnitude?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, that's what he's always done, and he will always do. I mean, he's just Bob, and he really knows what he's doing, and he is unafraid to go after these people, particularly when the feds won't. And I did try to discourage him from one thing. He was so angry at Jimmy Carter, right, Bob? Was it? No, it was Obama. It was Obama. He was so unhappy with Obama because Obama was not enforcing the sanctions against Iran, that he called Obama a certain word. And I said, you can't do that. Don't do that. Don't tell the newspapers. Well, the next day it was in the Wall Street Journal.
But Bob, you had said that this, while certainly the Obama administration was involved in not doing as much as you thought they should, correctly, that the preceding Bush administration had been pretty much the same way, and did it go back even into the Clinton administration?
Nobody on the federal side was aggressive about enforcing the sanctions. And it took a lot of time to build a case, but I mean, for instance, with Lloyd's, I mean, we found instructions from senior management to people at the working living, telling them how to conceal the origin of shipments. They had written instructions how to conceal the true owners. So it was all there. It just took some time to sort it out.
Indeed it did. I want to lighten up some. I want to say this directly, but I want to say it respectfully. The first time that Bob demonstrated that he was romantic, when he managed to get inside your front door, when you were ready to close the front door, you closed the front door and you suddenly realized the man had slipped in. I thought that was pretty funny.
That was that was not funny to me at the time. It was pretty scary because we'd gone out to dinner. He had paid for the taxi. I said, "Good night, Mr. Morgenthau." I went out one door, he went out the other door, followed me home. I said, "Good night, Mr. Morgenthau. Very nice to have seen you tonight." And went through the front door, and somehow he was there. And he was there in the elevator, and he was there at my front door. And I put my rather big leather satchel purse in the door, and I said, "Good night, sir." And I turned around, and somehow he was there. But it had a very happy ending.
Well, that leads to the second part of the question. This will not be the first time that you have heard this. But when people say to you, and I know they have said to you, "Love the book, think the book's terrific, but I do think one way or the other you got too personal. TMI, too much information about the personal relationship." To that you say what?
You should have seen the first draft.
Bob, do you remember that night when you slipped in the door? I mean, as one man to another, I tipped my Stetson to you. But do you remember the evening?
I do remember it very well. And I made her pancakes the next morning.
Well, that leads to the question, we move on. He said he made pancakes the next morning. Were they any good?
They were so good. They were really very good.
One of my specialties. I still like them.
He's a great cook.
Well, were the first years difficult? Okay, you have the courtship, you get married. Were the first years difficult or not?
They were both blissful and frenetic. It was my getting used to his friends, him getting used to the friends that I had left. One of them was a very good friend, and I asked Bob if he would accompany me to see Charlie. And we went in, and Charlie had a waterbed, and Bob sat or rolled on the waterbed along with the other guests. And he was, hail fellow, well met, having a great time. And then he excused himself to go in the men's room. And he came back a little pale, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he went, and so I got up, and we said goodbye. And I said, "What was wrong?" And he said, "Well, he had an American flag, a real American flag, as his shower curtain." And that was just a little too much. Too much information for him.
I know, Bob, that you know a lot about raising apples, that you have the apple orchard upstate in New York. Tell me about the time that you visited Ariel Sharon on his farm in Israel, and she was with you at the time.
Yes.
Was she bored?
No, she was fascinated.
Well, tell me about that. Did he know anything about raising apples?
Well, he was interested in growing watermelons, and he could not get seed for seedless watermelons. So I found a supply for him out in Ohio and sent them to him. And then when he came to New York, he came and visited us up in our orchard. It was something that was very important to my father, and so I've tried to keep it going, and my son is really running it now, and it's flourishing. One of the things that impressed me about Sharon then was that he had Arabs working for him on his farm, and he had such a good, easy relationship with these Arabs, and you know, people try to picture Sharon, you know, as the enemy of all Arabs and so on, and he wasn't. He got along extremely well with them, and they respected him. And you know, he was tough, but if he could see peace at the end of the tunnel, he would go for it. I mean, he was the architect of sending the Sinai back to Egypt. He's the only person that could have probably gotten away with that, because he saw that as an opportunity for peace with Egypt.
I want to pick up on, with Sharon, I'm interested, I didn't know, I interviewed Ariel Sharon twice, but I didn't know that he had Arabs working on his farm, because at least to the uninitiated, I would say, how could he trust these Arabs on the phone? From what you described, he trusted them completely.
Yeah, he did. He got along very well, and they trusted him. They trusted him.
And he would do things for them. He would, you know, put their children through school and, you know, give them wonderful housing. And he was a very generous and loving farmer and boss to them.
We've talked a whole range of subjects here. What's your favorite part of the book? I asked Bob this as we began. Now as we close, I'm going to ask you. I know as an author myself, not a very successful one, but nonetheless an author myself, it is like trying to pick one of your children. But what is your favorite, absolute favorite part of the book, and why?
Well, there are lots of favorite parts of the book for me, but I think one of them is when I had a big birthday coming and Bob surprised me with a little red sports car. And we had a whole gallery of different workers, and one of them, they were mostly Jamaicans, and one of them was standing on the hill as we zipped by, and he said in a loud voice, "Well, there goes Romeo and Juliet."
Well, we're going to open it up for questions now. The microphone is here if anyone has questions, and at the back of the room. Yes, sir.
This is not so much a question as it is an opportunity for me to thank Mr. Morgenthau in a public forum. For those of us who have been fortunate, blessed, and privileged to have worked for Mr. Morgenthau, or as we used to refer to him as the boss, I want to thank him publicly because of the impact he had not only on me as an attorney, but as a human being. And I'll share one story that I think really is a testimony to Mr. Morgenthau. When he inducted our class, he said to us, "I didn't hire you to win cases. You're all top students from top law schools. I assume you can win cases. I hired you for your judgment. It's every bit your job to free an innocent man as it is to convict a guilty one." And those words have resonated with me ever since, and I know for all of the attorneys, the ADAs, that we grew up with that knowledge and that sense of justice. And for that, I'm very grateful. So thank you, Mr. Morgenthau.
I've got a question that's a little different for Mr. Morgenthau than for the two journalists, but you talked about the importance of going back to your journal to correct your memories of what was going on. And I guess for Mr. Morgenthau, I wanted to understand how you felt, you know, eyewitness recollections, how important they were, and for the journalists, what you think about Brian Williams, and if you have any comment on that.
I appreciate the question and respect the fact you ask it. Number one, Brian Williams has been and remains a friend of mine. So you would want to mark that. What I have said, and I repeat it here, I don't know the details of what happened that day in Iraq, the day in question, nor do I know the details of the other questions about other stories that have come up in recent days. But I can bear witness that Brian Williams is a honest, decent man in a craft, in a trade, television, where that's very difficult. He's a good guy, period. He's also a very good reporter. Keep in mind, I don't know the details about the questions been raised about this report or that report, but I have been in the same war zones with him. I have been on some of the same battlefields with him, yes, competing, but there. And the times I've been with him, he not only was a good and decent man, he was a solid pro and a brave one. And that's as much as I can say, but I welcome any opportunity to say so, because he is a good and decent man. But I think some of the details of what he did or didn't do will be forthcoming, although I think it may take a while.
Mr. Morgenthau, there have been a couple of recent high-profile cases where the district attorneys failed to achieve indictment, and I was wondering what your take on those two cases is. You know, would you have handled matters differently?
Well, I mean, the important thing is to see that justice is done, and maybe an indictment isn't appropriate. I mean, take Strauss-Kahn, for example. The victim, the complainant in that case, gave 3 separate, distinct stories about what happened. And when a prosecutor puts a victim on the stand, you're vouching for the truthfulness of their testimony. But if they've given 3 distinctly separate stories, how do you vouch for their truthfulness? So I thought in that case he was absolutely right not to proceed with that indictment. I don't think you grade a prosecutor by how many indictments he gets. You grade him by whether he sees that justice is done in every case, and that may include not indicting somebody, not going forward. I mean, I've always resisted commenting on cases where I don't know what all the facts are. And it's tough enough making decisions when you have all the facts, but when you don't have them, it's a big mistake to express an opinion. I've always, you know, going back to the days when I was DA, I never want to comment on other people's cases.
Understood. Are these the kinds of conversations the two of you had when you would come home at night?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, on the Strauss-Kahn case, for example, this would be a question for myself, we'll go to the audience. I would think, you tell me if I'm wrong with the Strauss-Kahn, there must have been someone to say to you, look, it's a close call, so indict him, let a jury decide, and take yourself off the hook, which at least one moment in time in that case would have been a very popular decision to make.
Well, but you've got a higher duty than that. You can't proceed where you don't know whether your key witness is telling the truth. I mean, you don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and say, you know, am I prosecuting an innocent person? So you've got to have confidence that your key witness is telling you the truth, or you can't proceed. I mean, I must say I had a rather cynical view of Strauss-Kahn, and that is that I think the best thing that could have happened was that reasonable bail should have been set and he fled the country. And he's not going to come back and commit another rape. And I mean, the amount of resources that a case like that takes because of the press pressure, political pressure, causes many other cases to get less serious treatment than they deserve. But I think, I mean, Vance did come to see me a couple of times, and I was, very strong with him in this. I said, if you don't believe her story, you can't proceed.
We're going to go to the audience with, you have a questioner? Yes, ma'am.
When you started the program tonight, Mr. Rather, you and Lucinda, you mentioned that you were there to tell us a little bit, break a few myths about yourselves, Mr. Morgenthau and all. And your reaction to the story about Ariel Sharon led me to think that there are so many insights that the two of you and others, your peers, your colleagues, have about the truths behind the myths of what the general public think, and the generalities that I think lead to many of the misconceptions and problems that we face. And is there a place, in addition to this wonderful book, where you as a journalist and friends of yours can maybe do something to help dispel some of these myths publicly?
I think that's a very, very good point. And I don't know why the kind of journalism, the kind of investigative journalism that was done 10, 20 years ago is being done now. Maybe somebody would know that, for instance, the maid in the Strauss-Kahn case was almost 6 feet tall, and he was, much shorter, which made it kind of hard to believe that he would have attempted to rape her. I don't know the answer to why more of these details, more of these truths aren't published, but I agree with you. I think we live in a fog of myth about many of the issues of the day.
Well, one of the problems, and we'll get on to the next question because this is not a journalism forum, but the question is a deep and penetrating question in this instance. It's basically what has happened to American journalism. Part of what's happened to American journalism is it has has been the corporatization, the politicalization, and the trivialization of the news. Now, as to the first two, the corporatization, there's been a consolidation of media power. I know that sounds like some academic paper's title, but as fewer and fewer entities control more and more of the distribution. For example, the true national distribution of news in this country now is controlled, more than 80% of it is controlled by no more than 6, my count is 4, no more than 6 very large international conglomerates. Now, excuse my reporter's French if you must, they are in very big corporations are in bed with big government, whether that government in any given time is led by Democrats or Republicans. And increasingly, they serve each other's interests, and news operations are not carried on in the public interest. They're carried on in the interest of the corporate entities and whoever's in power in the government, not in the terms of the public. And as a consequence of that, you've had the trivialization of the news in 2 very important areas. One, at the very time where we need more, broader, deeper international news, we get less international news. The other is deep digging investigative reports, deep digging exposés in journalism. 2 reasons. One, they're among the most expensive things. So if you're sitting atop a corporation, you say, on the one hand, it's much cheaper to put 3 people in a room shouting at one another about what we should be doing in the Middle East or in Afghanistan or someplace than it is to establish bureaus in those countries. Number 2 is for investigative reports. So often the investigation exposing, for example, government malfeasance, you have the corporate entity which needs things from the powers that be in government in Washington. They're asking them for regulations or do away from regulations or pass legislation or not pass legislation. The government powers don't want those kinds of stories. The corporate powers say, not only is it expensive, but it gets controversial. So as a consequence of this, you've had a diminution of the kind of reporting that you've talked about. Next question.
Mr. Morgenthau, what was your most satisfying win as a prosecutor?
And I always said that every case is important to the victim. So we tried not to give special attention to high publicity cases. So I can't really say that one case was more satisfying than another. I guess generally, though, where we were able to make new law, that was satisfying to see that justice was done. And I think of the Silverman case. Irene Silverman, she was a widow living in a house not far from here, and she disappeared. There was no body, no witnesses, but the circumstantial evidence showed that she was murdered by this mother and son. In New York state history, there had never been a conviction where there was no body, no witnesses. And we went ahead with that case, and we obtained a conviction. And fortunately, so I didn't lose any sleep, the son in another similar case in California confessed the murder here in New York. But that kind of case where you proceed, where you know a crime has been committed and the law is unclear and you go ahead and you succeed, I mean, those cases are satisfactory.
A applause for the great, and I use the word measurably, the great Bob Morgenthau. And for the accomplished and Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author, Lucinda Franks. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.